Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephanie Jordan. I'm the local food program manager at Sustainable Solano, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's cooking class. This is Spring Greens with Laura Doyle, our guest chef. She was last with us in November last year doing a Thanksgiving sides and kind of interesting sauces class. So keep that in mind for the next time the holidays roll around. So if you've been here before, you know that this is one of many classes that we have been doing over the past couple of years. And the purpose is to raise awareness of our local farmers and crops grown here in Solano County, California. And we tend to focus a lot on what are called specialty crops, which are fruits, vegetables, tree nuts, and herbs. So it's a lot of the plant-based crops that are grown. And this is also part of our larger vision to bolster and strengthen our local food system. And so there's a lot more information about the classes and that larger project on our website, which can be found at sustainablesolano.org. All right, moving on. I would like to do a land acknowledgement and just recognize that we are on tribal land. And I'm going to drop into the chat a link so that you can find out a little more information about the land that you are on. Because California is home to about 200 different native territories and is unceded territory. And so I'm going to put this into the chat here. Bear with me here. I usually have Allison with me. All right, there's that. So please check that out. And the other thing I want to do really quick before I turn it over to Laura is I just wanted to kind of show you guys where on our website all of these recipes live and where you can find a printout of the recipe that Laura is doing today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. It's not that. Hold on here. Let me make sure I have my other. Make sure I have the website open. Da, 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 da. Okay, there we go. Let me try that again. Share the screen. There we are. All right. So this is the local food page at Sustainable Solano. And as you scroll down here, you'll find, I don't know why this layout's kind of goofy up there at the top, but if you kind of go down through all of this, we have our little seasonal spotlight. Underneath the middle dot, which is Eat Local Food, you will find the recipes. And when we click that, we get to our recipe bank here. And the first one over here is Spring Greens. So I'm going to click on that one. And then you'll get all of the recipes here on the web page. But if you do want to, print out a PDF for yourself, you can just do that right here. Download a printable version and up will pop this. And so then you can go ahead and print or put it into your little recipe binders, however you want to do that. So, all right, so that's where you guys can find it. And I am going to recommend also that you do either speaker view or, actually I'm going to spotlight Laura here in a second. So, and then I'll be able to see you. Gallery. So, all right. So I think that is about all I want to say right now. Oh, one more thing. For any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I will kind of log them on some scratch paper and we can ask them toward the end. Or if you would like to ask Laura directly, please raise your hand and I will unmute you. So, all right. That's it. Now I'm done. Over to you, Laura. That was about spring greens.
Hello, everyone. So welcome. We are going to be learning about spring greens today. So I thought the first thing to do is sort of identify what I mean by spring greens. So because anyone who goes to the farmer's market or maybe gets a CSA knows that here in California, at least where we are, greens are something you can get kind of all year round. And the winter greens are what we call hardy greens. And so those are things like kale, mustard, chard, collards, which are also some of the spring greens, but in the spring they're a little bit different. If you think about a kale that you got from the farmer's market in the winter, it's thicker, it's a little hardier, which is, I guess, why it's called hardy green. But in the spring, they're more tender because they're younger leaves. And if you think about the first recipe, we're going to use this chard, which comes from Full Valley Farm up in Cape. And you can see a chard, if you look at one you normally get at the grocery store, they're usually quite tall. The stem is really, really thick. This one is significantly smaller, and that has to do with the time of year partially, because earlier in the winter we were getting much larger leaves of chard in our CSA box. These are a lot smaller. Something else you might notice, something fun I found in the middle of my kale. I don't know if you guys, there's flowers. And that's something else that will start to happen with any greens that have been in the garden all winter long. Right now is when they're going to start flowering. So you've got hardier greens that are starting to kind of near the end of their life, and you've got these newer greens like the baby chard. I've got dandelion greens back here for a little bit later. And this is a radicchio. A little bit later in the spring, there's going to be a really cool abundance of trevisos and radicchios and frizzes and all these very, very bitter Italian greens, some of which are not green at all. This one's purple, but they come in really, really cool colors. And they're, if you know how to handle them, they're a really, really great way to add a little bit of bitterness to your salad. They're great if you're going to have a really rich meal, like a steak or a roast of some sort. The bitter really cuts through it. They help with digestion as well. Those bitter flavors really do help digestion. So anytime you're having a heavy meal, it's a great time to grab that salad that we'll do in a little bit. We're going to make 3 recipes tonight. The first is going to be Garlicky Sautéed Greens, which is sort of the most basic, simple way to cook greens. I've been teaching it for years. I've been cooking it for years. I almost always have a container in my refrigerator of this because you can literally do it with any kind of green that you have on hand. Then we're going to make a kale salad with bitter greens and lemon. And then we're going to make a chimichurri, which uses herbs, not truly greens, but they're green. And you can make a chimichurri. You can use other greens as well, not just herbs. It's sort of like a salsa verde, which if some of you were in my class in November, we made a salsa verde with sage. So it's basically the same idea. So those are the 3 things we're going to make tonight. So starting with the garlicky greens, I've got my pan here on kind of medium low, and I have got my chard. And as you can see, like I mentioned, these are very, very, very small leaves. Usually when I'm cooking chard, I will cut up the stem and start sauteing that first, and then I will cut up everything else. Because it's spring and these are so tiny, also, you can kind of see the stems are quite thin themselves. So they're not really, really thick, so they don't have to break down as much. So I'm just going to trim off the bottom of these because they're starting to look a little bit like that, they were cut a little while ago. So the very cut part is just starting to brown a bit. So you're just going to trim that off. And then the way that we're going to cut this is basically, we're going to just cut it into ribbons, which some people will call that a chiffonade. Usually when you're chiffonading, you roll up the leaves so that you can get a really fine little ribbon of usually herbs. It's often done with basil to use as a garnish. For this, I'm just gonna take my hand and I'm gonna do maybe about 1/2 inch thick, all the way up. And if these were very big leaves, I would maybe cut them in half. Often with chard, you'll see people kind of fold each leaf in half and cut out the stem. And that it takes so much time to do it that way. Because, you know, you got to kind of make a very special cut for each individual leaf, which for a whole bunch is a lot of little cuts. So I just chop it all up. Works out just fine. There are some greens that you do really want to remove the stem on, and we'll talk about that more when we talk about the kale. But things like kale and collards, those stems are very, very fibrous, and they're not really good to eat most of the time. Kale stems are actually pretty tender in the spring, so it's sort of up to you how much of them you want to remove. I have a method of how I do it, but I was teaching a cooking class to some 8 to 10-year-olds a few weeks ago, and one of them decided that her favorite part of the kale was the stems. Like, they were all kind of like, they kept taking the stems. And then, of course, you know, once one kid does that kind of thing, they all do it. They all start kind of munching on kale stems, which is pretty cool. So I've just put my kale in here, and I'm going to saute it around a little bit. I'm going to add some oil, just a little bit of olive oil. And with these greens, the cooking time really depends on which type of green you're cooking. So something like a collard takes a little bit longer than something like if we were cooking the dandelion greens, which we're going to be doing raw. They're very, very quick. So you want to look at the thickness of the leaf. You want to taste it raw and see, like, how much do you have to chew? If you have to chew a lot to get it to break down enough so that you want to swallow it, it's going to take longer than if you just pop it in your mouth and chew it up really quickly and swallow. Chard, I feel like it's somewhere in the middle. I don't like to overcook my greens, but I am going to sort of saute these for a little bit and then put the lid on to keep in some moisture and just turn it down to low and just let them sit. And honestly, that's most of the time how I cook my greens, because I'm not usually just cooking greens for dinner, right? I'm cooking a bunch of things. And so if I get the greens started and then I turn them down to low, sometimes I add a little water if I'm worried that they might get dry. And then I just put them on low and put a lid on them and set them in the corner burner of my stove so that I can cook everything else. And they'll just sort of slowly, you know, get softer and softer as they sit. The nice thing about these heartier greens like chard, kale, collards, things like that, is that they, if you did want to cook them for a really long time, like braise them, they do get very soft and kind of succulent. Something like spinach, if you overcook it, I'm sure some of you have had overcooked spinach before, and it just kind of like falls apart, like it's very unpleasant. But more of these hearty greens, they'll hold on the heat really well because they're gonna be fine with a longer cooking time. I just don't like to have them like regularly. I just kind of saute them and call it a day, because I'm usually throwing them into something else. Like sometimes I'll put them in a pile by themselves, but most of the time I'm adding them to a quinoa salad, or my husband is throwing them into a bowl of soup the next day. You know, we just kind of use them throughout the week once they're cooked, and they last for the whole week. So I just put in my garlic. For this recipe, I do about 5 cloves of garlic for 1 bunch of greens. You could go higher, you could go lower. I do also want to mention that in a recipe like this, where it's really cooking down, if the idea of chopping up a bunch of garlic and peeling it feels kind of overwhelming to you, go ahead and use the jarred stuff. There's a lot of, some people, especially chefs, will say that that's really, super subpar, not as good as fresh garlic. It's just different. And it depends on how you're using it. When it's something like this that's really cooked down, you're never going to notice the difference. I had a friend who I used to teach greens classes with at the co-op, and she did a test one day where she cooked a pan of this recipe with fresh garlic and with dried garlic, and no one could tell the difference. So if you need a shortcut to get more greens into your stomach, go ahead, buy that pre-chopped garlic or that peeled garlic, and it's fine. The important thing here is to eat your greens, right? I really like chopping up garlic. I kind of like the smell and the sort of rhythm of it. So I tend to mostly use that. But if I'm making, a curry that uses 4 tablespoons of garlic, I am definitely using a jar. Just put that out.
Okay. Laura, can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
So, a lot of times when we make salads, especially, we'll spin the greens dry in like a salad spinner or something. And I'm assuming with this chard, you're not really doing that because you want some of that moisture to help with the steaming.
Yes.
Yeah.
The steam is helpful in this case. So I take the whole bunch and I put it in my colander and just kind of spread it apart and rinse it. If you notice that your greens are very muddy, go ahead and fill a bowl with water and just kind of smush them around in there to just loosen up that mud, especially if it's been rainy and you're getting your greens from the farmer's market or from a CSA. There's a likelihood that there's going to be some mud because that's just the reality. They'll rinse it before they package it, but things grow in the dirt. So just kind of look at your greens, and if you notice a lot of dirt, then submerge them and smush them around. But otherwise, I just do a quick rinse in the colander, and then I just dump them in there with the moisture and all. Okay, this smells awesome. When the chard cooks, it gets this almost this like umami smell, like that smell that soy sauce sometimes has, that like kind of brown. I don't know how to explain it really. It smells a little bit like soy sauce, but there's no soy sauce in there. Soy sauce is a great addition. I am going to add a little bit of salt here. And now I'm going to just kind of put the lid on and let it sit for a little bit while I finish up everything else. And that's literally it. That's all I usually do. Ways that you can finish this if you want it to be a side dish of its own is you could do a little blurb of balsamic vinegar. That goes really, really well with dark greens. Soy sauce, as I mentioned, it already has a little bit of that soy sauce smell going on. So a little bit of soy sauce to finish it is an awesome way to sort of, if you're doing a stir fry, or if you're making some sort of Asian inspired or Chinese inspired, Japanese inspired meal, some cuisine that would use soy sauce. This makes a really easy, quick side dish to whatever you're doing as the main. Tahini is a favorite in our house. We usually use it in dressings for salads, but there's been a few times where I've just thrown a spoonful of tahini right into the greens. Particularly cabbage takes to that super, super well. Really good. Peanut butter. I mean, you could really just play around with it. In the recipe, I mentioned Parmesan cheese. If you do that, it just kind of creates this sort of creamy greens situation that's really nice. But I usually hold off on adding things like that unless I know how I'm using the whole pan. If I'm making a giant pan of cooked greens, I may not want every meal that I use that in to taste like tahini or soy sauce or balsamic or whatever I'm adding to it. So sometimes when I'm reheating it, that's when I'll add in those other ingredients. So now this is going to sit, and I'm going to rearrange my camera a little bit so that we're not staring at the stove the whole time. If anyone has questions about that recipe, now would be a fabulous time to throw them out there.
I don't see any in the chat, but you know what? I'm going to put your website in the chat. I just realized I didn't really, not sure if I really introduced you properly. Hold on here. I'm going to copy this. So Laura does private classes and also teaches through the Davis Food Co-op Teaching Kitchen in the Peregrine School. So I'm just going to put in, there it is. Da-da-da. All right, you can learn more about Laura there.
Yes. And my site is still, I'm still building it. So I'm starting to do more, starting to write some blog posts that haven't been posted yet, but hoping to do more of that in the future. But my email address is on there. So if anybody, you know, curious about other things that I do, feel free to reach out. All right, so this kale salad, this is sort of a variation on, you know, the general kale salad that I always do. It's probably the recipe that I have been, that the most people have walked up to me after I've taught it in a class and said, like, I make this every week now. And it's great because if you just take the massaged kale portion of it and just have that in your refrigerator, it lasts all week. So you can kind of add to it, same way with the sauteed greens. So it's another great, easy thing to do kind of on the weekend. And then, you know, when you're coming home right at dinner time, it's easier to get those vegetables in your meal. So what I'm going to do is I am going to switch to an overhead camera real quick so that I can show you what I'm doing here with massager. Okay, so this is a bunch of Lacinato Kale, sometimes also called Dino Kale. I reserved a couple leaves so that you could see. It looks a little scaly. So dinosaur skin is scaly. This looks scaly. Dino Kale. As I mentioned, the stems can be a little tough, and especially if you're having them in a salad. A lot of times if you get a bag of chopped up kale for salads, the machine just chops the whole thing up. And what I have found with that is it makes people really not enjoy kale salads because you're eating and then you're biting into this like giant fibrous stem. So the way that we're going to remove it is you're just going to pull the top part off just a little bit, and then you're going to pinch the stem in between your fingers and you're going to pull. Look at that. Just came right off. Now we got this nice leaf with no stem. It will self-break when it's basically as tender as the leaf. I'm just going to do that one more time. So loosen it up a little bit, pull it through. And same as with the chard, we're just going to chiffonade it, cut it really small, or in case you don't feel like chopping, you can just tear it. Once you've got all of this kind of torn into the bowl, we're going to take a little bit of the salt, and the salt is going to kind of break down the leaves a little bit to soften them, to make it less difficult to chew up. I find that the Lacinato kale is usually fine by itself. The curly leaf kale is a little denser, so it's harder to chew it if you haven't done this. And we're going to put a little bit of oil. That is going to, again, soften it up, help with that mouth feel. And we're going to squirt just the littlest bit of lemon juice. There's going to be a lot more lemon in the dressing, but this is just gonna, the acid's gonna kind of help to break down those greens. Now, you can use this method for any kind of dense green that's kind of hard to chew. You can use it for raw bok choy, kale, chard and collards. Chard particularly doesn't eat super well raw. It has a little bit of a muddy flavor, I have found. So what we're going to do is I just tossed all those ingredients in with the kale, And then I'm going to pick up it by the handful and I'm going to kind of squeeze it like this, kind of rubbing it between my fingers. And I'm going to just, I don't have to do this a lot. Just a few times will make it so much easier to eat. But the more you do it, the softer it will get. So for this particular salad, because the other greens I'm using are kind of soft, I kind of like to do it. You'll see that it starts to change color. The leaves will get darker and they'll start feeling a little slippery. And once you've sort of mushed it around a little bit and it feels nice and soft, and you can kind of set it to the side, it'll continue to soften a little bit as it sits. And then, so as you're preparing the rest of the salad, it'll just do its thing over there.
Laura, were you using kosher salt or just table salt on that?
Kosher salt, yeah. You could use table salt. I have found that kosher salt is, it's rougher, so it makes it a little bit, it does a little bit better job kind of mushing, breaking down the leaves. But if all you have is table salt, that'll work fine too. Okay, so while that is sitting, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the dressing. Okay, so this is a dressing that's based on something that my friend had when she was in Rome, and it was a bitter green salad. And it was literally just really bitter greens like radicchio, treviso, frisee, all those ones I mentioned at the beginning. And it was just dressed with garlic, lemon juice, olive oil, and then topped with kind of peels of Parmesan, you know, to look kind of like, and the Parmesan kind of cuts into the bitterness. There's something about the combination of the garlic and the lemon and the olive oil and the bitter greens that really, really works super, super well. So those are always really great flavors to grab when you're working with particularly bitter greens. So I'm just going to crush 1 clove of garlic. And this is going to be raw, but if you combine it with the lemon juice kind of mellows out that really intense raw garlic flavor. So what we're going to do is we're just going to squeeze the lemon directly into the bowl with the garlic. And we're going to let it sit. I first learned about this technique in, there is a cookbook called Zahav, and it is, I cannot remember the name of the chef, but it's from a Middle Eastern restaurant in Philadelphia, and he has a hummus recipe in there that is stunning. And the first thing that he does is he puts the garlic and the lemon juice together, and he just kind of lets them sit for a little while, and it just really mellows out the garlic a lot. So it's a lot of lemon juice. This is a big flavored salad. So we're just going to let the lemon juice and the garlic sit right there while we talk about the other greens. So we've got our kale sitting over there, and any bitter greens that you want to add to this, awesome. Also, I've done this with cabbage too, like purple cabbage in there. It's really, really pretty. If you were going to use something like a cabbage, put it into the bowl with the chard or with the kale when you're massaging it, because it could also benefit from that. For this one, we are going to use my most local ingredient, which is dandelion greens. These just came from my backyard. It's a great time of year for dandelion greens. When they are little like this, they're just not as bitter. If you've ever had dandelion greens from the store, they're very big And when they're big like that, they're much more bitter. But when they're little like this, they have a much more mellow flavor and they're much more tender. So they're really easy to eat. So they don't require any kind of marinating or cooking or massaging. Just chop them up. So that's what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna do a rough chop on this. And then, of course, I mentioned the Radicchio. Now, Radicchio is very bitter, no matter what time of year or how big you harvest it. If Radicchios are too bitter for you, but you still kind of want to play with them, if you roast them, or I mean, roasting them is really the best way if you're going to cook them. You just put them in the oven and roast them until they get brown on the edges. Just kind of quarter them and then roast them, and they really get kind of a sweetness that balances out a little bit of that bitter flavor.
You know what I've done with them too? I've grilled them.
Ooh.
Yeah. You just kind of, like you say, you quarter them. It's probably the same idea as roasting in the oven, to be honest with you. You know, drizzle some oil, a little salt and pepper, throw them on the grill just really fast. 1, 2, you know, and as soon as they start to get that little brown,
yeah,
pull them off and chop them and throw them in. It's kind of like a warm salad. Again, from Italy. Yeah.
They really like the bitter greens there. And the bitter, you know, it's also, if you think about like Italian cocktails, you know, like they use those bitter,
like liqueur things. I know what you're talking about. I can't.
Like Campari and things like that. They're very bitter. You know, you order one of these little drinks and I remember the first time I ordered one, and I was living in New York and I was just 21, and I was like, what is this? It's so bitter. But it's supposed to, you know, you're supposed to eat it or drink it with a big meal. And so it helps, or in between courses of a big meal. So it helps get your digestive juices going, you know, those bitter flavors. I'm just gonna kind of chunk this up. I could chop it finer. I kind of feel like with the bitter greens though, I generally feel like I like to have kind of bigger pieces of them. I don't know why. I'm just gonna put all of that together in the bowl with kale. There it is. It's so pretty. That green with the purple is one of my favorite combinations. Grab my little whisk. What I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna whisk together the lemon and the olive oil and the garlic, really just so that it pours together. It doesn't need, this is olive oil. It doesn't need to really be emulsified like a true vinaigrette, because it's got so much lemon in it, and it's really gonna kind of emulsify no matter what. Just kind of pour it over there. It's a lot of dressing. I like to go heavy.
And Laura, did you say that was roughly equal parts oil to the lemon juice?
Yeah, it was about equal parts. I did 2 lemons and I didn't measure it, but it seemed like about half a cup. But again, like you really want those big flavors to have with these bitter greens. And then you have something to kind of pull it all together and sort of mellow it out. Now, if I was going to plate this onto a platter and serve it, I might do those Parmesan curls, where basically you take a chunk of Parmesan cheese and you take a vegetable peeler and you make little shards of Parmesan and you put those on. And those are really nice to kind of get, actually, you know what? I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna show you how to do it. Benefit of doing this in my own kitchen, I can just decide to show you something.
Right. Exactly.
We got it right here. All right, so here's the Parmesan. Brand new package. Very, very raffle. My goodness.
Oh yeah. The joys of packaging.
Okay, so I have this chunk of Parmesan here, and I'm just gonna take a vegetable peeler and I'm gonna just do peels like this. They're not really gonna kind of twist, you know, like, but they end up being these kind of shards of Parmesan that you can bite into, which is kind of nice. Especially, you know, if you've got a bite that has a bunch of the Radicchio coupled with the creamy Parmesan, really, really nice. Kind of cuts through that bitterness super, super well. And, you know, it looks nice.
Yeah.
So you can stir this in, or you can do stir it all up and then just put the Parmesan on top kind of as a garnish, and then as people are serving they can kind of scoop it with the Parmesan. Either way works just fine. And if you don't have the Parmesan and you don't want to do it that way, just have some grated Parmesan tossed in there. Will kind of give a similar, it will be in every bite of course, but it will give a kind of a similar creaminess which will kind of cut through that very bitter flavor of the Radicchio. And if I had those other bitter greens, I would put a bunch of them in here, and it ends up being a very, very colorful, interestingly textured salad. Because frisee is the one that has these little, like, it looks like a head of lettuce, but each leaf is kind of frizzy. It's frisee. And then Treviso is more kind of oblong. And there's lots of different ones. So there's ones that are green. There's ones that are green with red speckles, which is my favorite. I love that one. It makes for some really, really pretty salads. So as they start coming to the farmer's market, grab some and try them out. Okay. Moving right along.
How's your chard doing? It's just been sitting over there.
Great, yes. It's just sitting there on low. I will pull it open. It probably could come off the stove now. And it, as you can see, it's very, very soft. The color has gotten a little more brown than red. But it smells awesome. The garlic with the chard smells so good. And it's going to be a great addition to lots of things later this week.
I would say you could put that on a pizza too.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, garlicky greens can almost go on anything. I put them in omelets. I put them in quiches. I like to make stratas with leftover bread, which is basically like cubes of leftover bread and like whatever you've got in your refrigerator leftover, and eggs and cream, and you mix it all together. It's kind of like a savory bread pudding kind of. A great way to use up leftovers. It's like that, or quinoa salad is our usual go-to of like, we've got too much cooked vegetables, let's do. All right. So for our final recipe tonight, we are going to do a chimichurri. And chimichurri is a salsa verde style sauce that is traditionally from Argentina. It's often served with steak or grilled chicken. I had a boss at one point who was from Argentina, and she would serve it with her empanadas. So she would, take a bite of empanada, and then she'd put a spoonful of chimichurri and take another bite. And it was served like, instead of dipping, it was just like every time you took a bite, you locked on some chimichurri. It's really, really good. Like I said, it's pretty similar to a salsa verde. And a salsa verde, we're talking about an Italian salsa verde. We're not talking about a Mexican salsa verde, which is a fully different thing, including lots of chilies and tomatillos. This is green herbs of some sort, garlic, olive oil, vinegar, salt, pepper, all mixed up together. It's very bright. It's very fresh. It really is a great way to add brightness to a dish. The one I taught in November used sage. So it was a really, really wonderful thing to add to your Thanksgiving meal, which can kind of be a little lacking in the acid department. And so it really just gave an awesome zing to anything that it got plopped on. So for this one, I'm going to kind of keep it fairly traditional. And we're going to do parsley and we're going to do cilantro. Now, with both of these herbs, you have these thicker stems and they do have a lot of flavor in them. So if you were going to be making, for example, a Thai curry, something like that, cilantro stems are actually, you want to keep them and use them. For this, I don't bother getting rid of any herb stems that are really tiny like this. The thicker ones for this, just because of the texture, I'm going to kind of set to the side. But sometimes I'll just keep them in the freezer, either in my broth bag, which I like to keep kind of scraps in a bag for making it into chicken broth, or maybe separately if I know I'm going to be using making a curry anytime soon. I will keep those in there. But you can, same way we did with the kale, just kind of pinch it between your fingers and pull it out. You may have seen there are some tools out there that are intended for taking the leaves off of herbs and things like that. That's basically a piece of plastic with a bunch of holes that are different sizes. It looks like a guide for finding the size of your drill bit or your knitting needle, you know, it's like a gauge guide, but you stick the stem through and then you pull it, but save your
I've never seen that. Where?
I don't remember. I feel like it was at Pampered Chef or something like that. It was something that I was seeing around a lot when I was in college. And I just remember looking at it and being like, my fingers do that. I don't know why you would need.
It's one more thing to wash.
Right, exactly. Yeah. All right, so there's my cilantro, and I'm just gonna grab the parsley also. I already kind of tore off these greens are cilantro, and this is parsley. And what I've done for the parsley, because it had kind of thicker things down here, I just kind of broke them off. But I'm just going to leave these thinner stems up at the top because, again, they taste fine, the texture's not bad, and it takes a lot less time to make your chimichurri if you just chop them all up together. So here I go. I'm just going to do a rough chop. You can make them as fine or as coarse as you would like. You chop up parsley, there is just this like burst of incredibly fresh smell that is awesome. It's really great.
Laura, I was making an assumption that you were using Italian flat leaf parsley. Someone was asking about the greens, so okay.
Yes, it is flat leaf parsley. I find it has just a much stronger flavor. The curly leaf looks pretty, but I feel like it doesn't really taste like much. Now, if you feel like you don't if the fine chopping feels like a bit too much, you can also do this in the food processor. Just kind of pulse it until it's finely chopped. Just by itself, not adding anything in. Loud chopping right now. All right, so that's pretty good. They're pretty fine. They're not. It's sort of think about how you're going to eat it and what you're going to want in your mouth. But this is about a cup of chopped herbs. And I mentioned earlier you could do this with any of those little spring greens. Dandelion greens again would be awesome in here. I almost did that just to sort of see what it tasted like, but I had parsley and cilantro, so I decided to stick with it. But I think that that would be really, really good. This is oregano. This is also from my garden. Any oregano you do want to try and have fresh in this. This is not, chimichurri is not somewhere where you're going to want to use dried herbs. So if you don't have fresh oregano, swap in something else. You can do this with basil also later in the summer. It's sort of like a little bit quicker than a pesto, because sometimes pesto can be a little bit finicky to get the right consistency. And if you don't want something that's really creamy and you really just want more of that fresh basil flavor that hasn't been pureed quite so much. It's really, really good on grilled things. Any kind of grilled meats or vegetables are awesome with a chimichurri. Goes really well with that chard flavor. Where I have, there we go. There we are. Okay, so I got some more garlic here. Again, more garlic. And also, if you have a lot of lemon juice and you want to use lemon here instead of the white wine or red wine vinegar, go for it. And just adjust it to taste. If you feel like the 2 tablespoons of lemon juice is not enough, you need more of that kind of acidic pop, then just add a little bit more. Okay. One thing I will say about the salsa verde is it does not, and chimichurris, they don't last very well. Like with pesto, you can freeze it, but with salsa verdes, you kind of have to use it within 2 or 3 days. But you can make it a little bit of a head. You know, if you know, on Sunday that you're going to be having a steak on Wednesday and you want chimichurri with it, you could make it then and kind of keep it in the fridge, and that would be okay. Always best super fresh, but life
Yeah, I
is not
wonder. I'm kind of wondering about freezing it, like in little ice cube tray thing. I mean, I freeze pesto all the time. I make a big batch in the summer and stick it in there, and so, but I don't think I've ever tried freezing chimichurri.
Yeah, I haven't either. I think because of the way I use it, I always sort of think of it as like a fresh thing that I, chop up the greens, add the garlic and the acid and the oil, and
it just gets eaten up faster.
Yeah, exactly. It's great on sandwiches too, actually. Leftover chimichurri is awesome, just kind of smeared on a sandwich with.
Oh yeah. Potatoes, eggs.
Oh yeah, roasted potatoes. So good. Like breakfast potatoes also.
Yeah, definitely.
So that was 4 cloves of garlic that I smushed into here. I used a garlic press for that. And then I'm going to pour in my white wine vinegar. And again, olive oil. Now, when we are using olive oil in an application like this where we're not heating it up, this is a great time to actually use that bottle of olive oil that you got that was special that you've been saving, because it will not last forever and you should just use it in your salads or your sauces. There's something else. Oh, salt, of course. A little bit of salt, black pepper. And if you like, some crushed red pepper flakes. If you know that there's somebody in your family that doesn't like that, then feel free to leave them out. If you don't like them, leave it out. I like to add it because I really like having that little bit of spice with that really acidic tinge of the vinegar. And I know my kid's not going to eat this anyway, so I don't have to worry about her saying it's too spicy. I will say that right now, as I'm stirring this up, like I can feel my mouth watering, which is something that vinegar does a lot of the time. It's sort of like we were talking about how the bitter greens can kind of like help to start those digestive juices going. And vinegar, I feel like has a very similar, you know, like it makes me, I'm like ready now to eat this. Once you have stirred it all up, you want to go ahead and give it a taste. Putting a spoonful of this in your mouth feels like too much. It's a great, you could use a cracker or some bread. I personally like it enough. I'm just going to taste it. I think that's good. I don't feel like it needs any more salt. There's a really very subtle heat level in there because that was about half a teaspoon or so of pepper flakes. And it's got a lot of very, very fresh herbal flavor. I could see how it would be awesome with lemon juice too. It would be a little less sharp, a little more just that citric acid instead of the vinegar. It's good.
Good.
And so yeah, spoon this over everything. But make sure you eat it quickly because you don't want it, you know, I feel like it's so easy when you make a sauce like this to overthink how you're going to use it. You're like, oh, you've heard that it's really good with steak. And so you have it with steak one night and then it just sits in the back of your refrigerator until you clean your refrigerator next and then it's kind of like slimy and you don't want to eat it.
Yeah.
So instead just play, right? What's the worst that could possibly happen? If you're really nervous about it, like take a bite of something in your spoon and put a little bit on top and see what it tastes like. And if it tastes awesome, great, keep going. This is another thing that would be great added to a grain salad because it's got all those very, very strong flavors, which really balances out those, you know, especially something like farro or kamut or wheat berries that have that very chewy, kind of nutty, earthy flavor. This is something, adding something like this is going to really kind of like bring it back up to something that's makes your mouth excited. So
awesome. That's great. Thank you, Laura. You know, you were talking about saving your cilantro stems, and I just wanted to mention that I believe on our website there is a recipe. I think it's called like a coconut curry or something, and we make a homemade green curry paste using the cilantro stems. So if you're looking for something to do with the stems after you've done the chimichurri, check it out.
Yeah.
And it
awesome.
just,
yeah,
just the stems along with a bunch of other stuff. So
yeah, a lot of and the more traditional recipes, they use cilantro root, which is very, very hard to find in the States. Most stores don't sell cilantro with the root still attached. So the stems are a really good approximation of that flavor.
Yeah. Lovely. All right. I am going to put in the chat right now a survey link this helps us out with our reporting, and also it helps us to get more ideas from all of you concerning what you might want to learn about or what you would like to see cooked. So please fill it out. It's just right there in the chat. SurveyMonkey, pretty straightforward. It's only about 5 or 6 questions. And again, really helps us. So, all right. Are there any other questions? I think you answered quite a few of them as we went along. People were wondering about the olive oil or which kind of oil. And, you know, I agree with your chimichurri recommendation. You know, you can kind of play around with the different acids, whether it's the vinegar or the lime juice or the lemon juice. And, you know, maybe how would you suggest, like if you're playing around, you know, how do you kind of keep it balanced as you're going, right? And just kind of go back and forth between the oil and the acid, or I mean, the salt kind of helps to tame the acid too, I think.
Right. Yeah. So a recommendation I saw recently was to, when you're starting to do substitutions, whether it's in cooking or in baking, to start doing by doing 1-to-1, right? So if you know I have 2 tablespoons of vinegar, but I want to try something else, then do 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, because that way the ratio of the, like, how everything is going to taste, like the texture is not going to get as affected. And you know, the other thing that I often suggest, which is a little bit more tame, is that a good first step, if you're going to be substituting in a different ingredient for some or all of another ingredient, if you want to make this and you don't have vinegar but you have lemons, just do a 1-to-1. If you're curious what lemon is going to taste like in there, but you don't want to switch it out completely, do 1 tablespoon of lemon and 1 tablespoon of vinegar, so that, you know, so just kind of don't, the main thing to do is try not to play too much around with the amounts, but changing around some of the ingredients is pretty easy. So like vinegar, you can substitute any kind of vinegar. You can substitute pretty much any kind of citrus. Something like an orange is going to be less sour, obviously, but it's still gonna, might taste awesome. I mean, I don't know. I've never tried orange juice in a chimichurri, but I imagine it would be amazing. But you know, you wouldn't want to, you know, add those 2 tablespoons of, or be like, okay, well, I'm gonna do lemon juice instead, so instead I'm gonna do double the amount. Then it's gonna be really watery. So start with just keeping the measurements the same.
Right, right. All right. Thank you so much. Got lots of thank yous, and everyone wants to taste the kale salad, and they're ready to put the chimichurri on everything. So
awesome.